My name's Dave DeBoe, founder of MoneyPartnerFormula.com, and this show is built for everyday real estate investors who are actively doing deals and looking to scale using other people's money. So if you're an active real estate investor and you want to get featured on this show to talk about your own real estate and capital raising experiences, then just go to daveinterviewsyou.com. Now let's get rolling with this episode, and remember to subscribe for daily interview content.
All right, guys, welcome to Property Profits Podcast. I'm your host, Bryce Kaminsky, filling in for Dave Dubois. And have you ever wondered, the Canadian market is crushing me. I can't buy a door to save my life. And just over the lake, there might be a few properties that you might be interested. Today on the show, I got Glen Sutherland, who's pretty much mastered the cross-border move. And I'm super excited. I'm super interested in the topic, as I've been for years. So Glen, welcome to the show. Great to have you here.
Well, thanks for having me, Bryce. Yeah. I don't know where we want to go with this. I can talk about all kinds of different topics across
Well,
cross-border.
I think the big topic, and I think the best thing we can use the time for, is demystifying what people think is like an impossibility. So when you look at the border, people like it's almost like a black hole. They're like, how do I even do it? So if we could start there, like, well, let's do one little piece for people who maybe don't know who you are. So Glen, give them the 30-second elevator of who Glen Sutherland is.
So I'm Glen Sutherland, host of a Canadian Investing in the U.S. podcast, YouTube channel as well. We buy a lot of properties in the U.S. I'm also managing partner at GMA Capital, which is for syndicating deals in the U.S. But I do a lot of single family duplexes, fourplexes, and then as of recently, we got into the bigger stuff. I coach people how to do it, and honestly, even that's what the podcast is as well. It's kind of the free version of coaching people how to do it.
Yeah, I saw on Facebook you just sold one of your properties. I guess it was in Cleveland or
Two
somewhere in
this weekend,
Ohio.
actually. Yeah, we sold
There
two
you
this
go.
weekend. Well,
Yeah.
sold's a strong statement. We put two under contract till they close. They're not sold.
Is it a little bit tighter in the States? Like, do they fall apart a lot more than in Canada?
Uh, to be completely honest, I've only ever done like I think eight or nine properties in Canada. So those ones all closed fine. So it's I've done a lot more scale in the US, right? So I don't know. I've just seen you just do enough properties, you're going to see a lot of weird stuff. People go get a car loan the week they're closing a house and screw the whole
No.
thing
Yeah.
up, and yeah, just
Yeah.
dumb stuff.
So let's jump on that. What we were gonna jump into
Yeah,
is like
yeah.
when you look at the border and you look at the black hole of like how do I do it? What are some myths about investing in the United States as a Canadian that you can demystify for us?
I think there's a few of them. Like I think the big one is that I can't get lending. I'm going to get screwed on taxes. I'm going to get screwed when I sell the property. Are some of the big? I think those are the biggest ones
Mm-hmm.
anyway. So I don't know. Maybe we start with like lending. Or is that where you want to go? Or
Yeah.
sure.
Like, how do I get a loan if I'm a Canadian? I know the banks can give you some general financing, but as an investor, I know there's a lot more options as I've been looking into myself. But what do you do when you're financing down there?
Yeah, so there it is. You can go to the Canadian banks, you can go to the American banks, and it goes both ways. So if you're an American going to invest in Canada, you're not going to get typically the same leverage or interest rates as you would if as a Canadian would get. And same thing happens when you go to the U.S. So typically you're paying an extra 0.5% compared to what an American would, and typically you're going to put down an extra 5% in leverage. So depending on what kind of loan you're doing, because they do vary, but typically you're
Mhm.
putting down a little bit extra because it's all risk and reward, and honestly they don't have the same recourse to go after us like because we're not in the United States. Like a lot
Yeah.
of it is based on serving paperwork, and they can't cross the border to serve us, so
Yeah.
they don't have the
So
same
they
thing.
have to
So
like serve your corporate entity or your LLC, because I know that some people are when they think about setting up and going to the States, they always talk about getting an LLC and getting an
oh yeah.
ETIN and these other things that I guess are important. Can you operate? Can you do your first property without going through all those hoops, or do you have to get set up like that to really start investing?
No, so that's a really good question. So technically, no. Like even to do this, whatever, technically you don't need a corporate structure, an entity. You don't need to get an EIN number. Um, The thing is, if you don't, you're opening yourself up to liability, right? And depending on your personal situation in Canada, like how much T4 income, how much investment income,
Hmm.
if you're not setting up the structure the correct way, you might not be getting the best tax benefits that you could be getting by just doing it in your personal name. But there are perks to doing it in your personal name. Like you could go to, RBC, TD, BMO, Adrian, I believe, is down there. Um, anyway, there's all these Canadian banks that are down in the US as well. Almost all of them have an affiliation
Hmm.
to either one with the same name as them or something completely different. Typically, you will get higher leverage by using like RBC, TD,
Hmm.
National Bank, or one of those ones in the US, their American version, but they're going to make you personally qualify, right? So as far as
Yeah.
I know, none of those banks will give a loan to your entity or your corporation or your LP or your LLC or however you're set up. They won't lend to that. So and it's going to also dig into your scalability, right? So it might be
Yeah.
a way to get a cheap loan off the start, but overall, it well, for instance, like a lot of these banks are going to be going under the same banking rules as Canada. So they're going to give you a maximum of 5 properties in your personal name, or 4 or 10, depending on what year we're talking about.
Yeah.
Um, but that's still going to apply in the US. So they're going to count your, because they're a cross-border bank, they're going to count your house in, Winnipeg or
Hmm.
Toronto. They're going to count any rental properties you have in your personal name in Canada. And then you're going to go in the US, right? So, hey, I want to go buy one. I want to buy Airbnb that I'm going to use in the winter, and I'll,
Hmm.
send it out the rest of the year to Airbnb it or something. Hey, it might be a way to do it, but you are opening yourself up to liability. If something happens, they're going to sue you personally, instead of suing a corporation that really has nothing but that property in it, right?
Hmm.
So you are opening yourself up that way. You are, but maybe I'll backtrack. You can get mortgages from American banks. That is one thing that's a big myth. And it's a lot of people, they think that they can't because they walk into Bank of America, Chase, Wells Fargo. They walk into the big guys, and honestly, they don't need us. They don't
Hmm.
really. It's just not even in their wheelhouse. They're not interested in it, and they just aren't interested in the risk for it. So typically, you're dealing with a DSCR lender, so it's debt service coverage ratio is how they're going to evaluate your properties. Which honestly, what it just means is this property cash flow? Does it actually make sense? More like a commercial property would be evaluated in Canada, but
Hmm.
you're doing it in a residential scale, right? It could be a fourplex, it could be a single family. Um, but yeah, you can go with those, and like I said, the interest rate will be a little bit higher, the leverage will be a little bit lower, than even working with the RBC TDs and the Canadian banks that are down there. But
But
you can let
if you have to fix it up,
yeah,
they're you're not going to have a debt service ratio that they're going to like, because it's not going to have a tenant, and you don't
yeah,
have any like banking history down there. So that would be more if you're buying like a turnkey thing. You're like, I
correct.
like this thing, I can rent it out in a month, doesn't need any work.
Or
Go.
something you're going to refinance into, right? But Canadians can go get like a construction loan in the United States, right? The same DSCR lenders just have a different program that they will put you into. Like typically they're portfolio lenders, um, and they're typically backed by mortgage-backed securities, meaning that whenever they underwrite the loan, they don't keep it in house. Typically, they'll securitize the loan and sell it in the secondary market. But that doesn't really affect you. You're going to
Mhm.
give you your money and you're going to make your payments, and it'll from your perspective, it won't really be any different. Um,
So let's talk about, like, yeah, that's the possibilities. Let's talk about, I want to scale, I want to structure. What's the best way to do it? Or what's
well,
a more structured way to do it? Because best is kind of a word that you that'd be subjective. But what's a better way to structure it than just going down there and guns blazing, go to some loan and get some
yeah.
bank to finance you or something? What's an easier way, or what's a more structured way to approach the idea of investing in the States?
Well, if we're going down like corporate structure wise, it's going to depend, right? If
And
you
just for everyone listening, we aren't advisors, we aren't
yes.
lawyers, doctors, dentists. We're just experiential knowledge. So if you need that sort of specific lawyers and stuff like that, you should consult them. Okay, the disclaimer's
Yes,
in. Go.
there's the disclaimer. Um, And honestly, the best thing is if you go to talk to an attorney or a CPA or someone who's going to try and set this up for you, is it should be tailored advice. Like it shouldn't be the one size fits all advice because it's going to depend on your situation. In most cases, I say you shouldn't use an LLC at all. The problem with using an LLC, if that's your only, there's ways to build it into your structure, but if that's your only structure, the way Canada Revenue will look at it is they'll look at that as a corporation and they'll tax it as a corporation. And the IRS will tax it as a flow through entity, which means that that income flows down to your personal return. So you'll pay
Mhm.
personal taxes in the US and corporate taxes in Canada, and you get yourself into a double tax situation. There is reasons and situations to use LLCs, but like at a beginner level, I would just say the easiest advice is just to skip it. What more commonly you're going to be doing is a limited partnership setup or a C corp setup. An S corp setup in the U.S. we actually we can't get it as a Canadians. We're not eligible for that. Um, so it's going to come down to what your tax burden is in Canada. What makes sense, right? What are you planning to do with the money? Are you planning to reinvest the money? Because a certain structure, like maybe I won't say specifics, but whatever, C corp will likely be more of where you want to be because you can keep yourself in a lower tax bracket because you're just paying corporate taxes. You're not paying personal taxes unless you do a dividend. But if you're going to be doing that and pulling dividends out to live off of, then it might not make sense, right? And the other big alternative that a lot of people use is a limited partnership, right? Problem with a limited partnership compared to an LLC because they are both flow through entities. But the problem is there's two partners and they aren't limited by liability. So typically the general partner is going to take on all the liability and the limited partner is going to be limited to the amount of cash they put in. So a lot of times they'll throw an LLC or a C corp or just some other entity in there as the general partner. And then you will sit there on the limited partner side to take away the liability. So it'll be more similar to an LLC, except that you had to set up a couple corporations to do this. In 2024, there's all new tax laws from Canada Revenue trying to tax foreign income. So without spending a whole hour on just this one topic, there's a thing called FAPI, FAPI tax. And really it's talk to a tax professional so you know that make sure they understand what we're talking about and if you bring up that topic.
Mhm.
But in a lot of cases what it's requiring now is to bring yourself into the more tax favorable situation. It's setting up a Canadian corporation that owns the American corporations and bringing
Mhm.
money back as management fees rather than passive
Profit.
income.
Yeah.
So yeah, because if you're bringing stuff back actively, it's taxed better in Canadian corps. If you're bringing it back passively, it's going to be taxed higher. So
Mm.
with a lot of this stuff, if you can prove that you're doing an active business, but this is a whole thing. Like I could talk
Mhm.
about this for like an hour and a half. So,
Well, and
but
it makes sense, like what you're saying about, because you will be managing them to some degree. It's not like you're going to be completely hands off. Even if you're managing a management team, you're still, on the daily, yes, change the hot water tank. And
yeah,
now you're doing your management. So, um, that's good advice. As we said in the disclaimer, if you needed a professional, get a professional. But that's a great starting point. I appreciate you, tipping the hat for those who are a little bit in the dark on that. So beyond the structure, um, you operate out of Ontario.
correct.
Or do you actually physically go there for portions of the time? Like, are you a remote investor, as they would say, or are you more of I'm going down to, I don't know, Florida for 3 months?
Yeah. No, I'm what you consider a remote investor. I do go down to the US probably every 3 months or so, right? But it's not for the reasons that people think. A lot of times it's you got to keep up relationships. So it's, shaking hands, going out for some drinks, going out for dinners. And honestly, the reasons I usually go there is because I have students that just want to see what's going on. They want to see projects. They're used to working in their own backyard. And a lot of times they're coming with me like, oh, Glenn, so what does this property look like? And I'm like, I don't know, I've never been inside of it. And I'm like, I have some, video stuff, but a lot of times when I'm going down there, it's not because I need to do the actual business. A lot of this stuff you can set up remotely, and it's all about is just setting expectations with everyone, contractors. You got to treat them I hate using this term, but if you're going to get a puppy, you got to set all the rules, when the meetings happen, everything happens, how they're going to be paid, when they're going to be paid, what the expectations are, how. If you set all the rules ahead of
Mm-hmm.
time, you can play this like, hey, we need to do a meeting every one Monday, right? At a certain
Mm-hmm.
time. And if you don't, then this is what happens. Like there has to be the whole game plan set out, because otherwise you're going to have people that just don't give you updates and you aren't doing this. So there is an art to doing it remotely. The same thing, like where I learned this is I was learning this, doing this in Ontario.
Mm-hmm.
So I originally started investing in my own backyard, but then I started buying properties that were like 3 hours away because I could get
Yeah.
much better numbers than where I lived. And
Mm-hmm.
once you start setting up systems like this, you start thinking about what you're doing. You start writing down how a closing goes, what the all the paperwork that a lawyer or attorney needs, all the paperwork that everybody needs, right? To apply for the
Mm-hmm.
loans, to apply for the mortgages, to apply for the title companies or the attorneys. And you just start documenting, making checklists, and you can start scaling this out to invest anywhere in Canada, invest in the United States. Um, Honestly, by getting a coach or someone to help you along with this, you'll make a lot fewer mistakes. Because
And
myself,
that's something that you do with your students.
yeah, yeah.
Like
So
this, because what we're talking about, if for those maybe who haven't put the dot, who haven't like connected the dots, is this SOP. You've got a very tight system, standard operating procedure, so that there's no guesswork. Because a lot of times when we're in our own backyard, we can go and have that conversation. We can stand around on in the house and be like, "Oh yeah, these lights need to be replaced," and
yeah,
but when you're at 1,000, that's one thing that I'm always talking about with acquisitions, especially with building businesses. Like scaling is like you got to pretend you're 1,000 miles away, because if you don't, you're going to end up working in your business your whole life. So the only way you can make it a business is you get 1,000 miles away in the mindset of it. You might be down the street, but your systems and operating procedures need to be set up that you can be in Florida and your property in London, Ontario still gets done.
yeah.
So how is that procedure? Like, did you have a starting point? Did someone train you into doing this, or was it all just like trial by fire for you?
For me, it's a lot of it's trial by fire, at least the way I started. Um, how I started that was I initially, um, when I did properties in Ontario, I would take vacation from my 9 to 5 job to go work on my property, which is
Mm.
completely insane, right?
Yeah. Well, we all got to start somewhere.
But I started doing with that sort of thing and that mentality and stopping by all the time and collecting rent all the time, being my own property manager and doing everything locally.
Mhm.
But whenever I first went to the United States, I picked Alabama as my first state. And one of the
Okay.
reasons was it was so far away. It wasn't like a Michigan or a New York that I could just
Yeah.
like slip over if I needed to, that it was a haul, right?
Yeah.
It was going to force me to do this. And then a lot of it was just keeping track of it and trial by fire. And then, the first one, you learn stuff from. The second one, you refine it. The third one, you refine it, and you just keep refining until you're like, hey, we have something here, and we have
Mhm.
an operations manual that we, like you just said, that we can literally go through and repeat the same process, because it's just going through checklists. It's just doing things in the right order and interviewing people properly
Yeah,
before.
and I was just gonna say, because one of the things that was most challenging when I was working in Cleveland was the contracting side of things, because there is a vast difference between the quality of contractor from the lowest grade contractor to the highest grade contractor. And when we're doing these projects, we can't normally afford like these kitchen and bathroom people that come in and do fantastic carpentry and all that. We're mostly dealing with some guy named George and his three guys, and they do good work, but they're only George and three guys for a reason. So we have to be kind of on top of them a bit. So how do you manage the contracting side of things from a distance? Because that's where I found being on the ground was really helpful, and going there every day, because you did kind of have to hold their hand a little bit. So how do you hold their hand at 1,000 miles?
So a lot of it is that you have to realize that you can't hold their hand. Um,
Okay.
so you're gonna have to step back, and you're gonna have to bring in somebody else to watch over them, right? So say you were gonna do a construction loan on the
Mhm.
property.
Mhm.
And that's how I learned a lot of these techniques, is you just copy someone else who's already got this down to a fine art, right? You
Yeah.
don't need to reinvent the wheel. And with a construction loan, you're gonna do draws, right? In order to
Mhm.
do a draw, which a draw is to get money for part of the renovation. So
Yeah.
the bank won't pay for stuff that isn't done. You're going to have to pay the deposits or anything to get going with the contractor. And then contractor's going to come back and say, hey, I got half the drywall done. Can I get a draw? And you go back to the bank. If you ask them to do a half draw, it's not possible. They don't
No.
work that way. Is the drywall 100% done or is it not done at all? Is the trim 100% done or is it not done at all? Is the kitchen 100%? Everything runs like that. And if you can run that same method, and then how a bank will do this is you say, hey, the whole bunch of things are done, and then they are going to send someone over to make sure it's done, right?
Hmm.
And they'll go through their whole paperwork, and it's either is it 100% done or is it not done? And
It's
this
either
doesn't
done
have
or
to
not.
be, yeah. And you get somebody to do this. It could be like the coffee girl at your property management company that you hired out, right? It doesn't have to be because all you're doing is you're giving them a very specific task. Can you go around and check to make sure that there is trim in every single piece and it's done right? So anytime you see anything that looks out of place, take a picture of that corner and label where that is, right? Just
Hmm.
you can write on your phone nowadays, just say where that corner is. Um, and then let me know because I'm going to have to go back to them and say, hey, you need to fix this corner before I can do the draw, right?
Yeah.
And same thing with the roof. Hey, can you get an angle where to see if there's only one layer of shingles on this? Can you give me pictures and make sure the eaves troughs are straight? Just if you're specific, anybody can take these pictures. If
Hmm.
people think they need to hire a home inspector to do this, obviously that's the most ideal situation, but that's going to be the most expensive
Yeah.
situation.
Every time they show up, a couple $100 or something like that.
Oh yeah,
I've also heard of people using their like local realtor to go down there
yeah.
because if you're flipping, they're definitely interested in you finishing that thing. So you can usually leverage the realtor to get those like remote photos. But it's I guess what you're really talking about is affordable boots on the ground in whatever way that you can leverage the people who are most interested in this thing completing, whether it's going to be your property manager because they're waiting to rent it out, or your realtor who's waiting to sell it, or I guess that'd be like the bank is going to double check everything. But if they go down and do the paperwork, then it comes back with some red X's on it. You're going to have to wait probably another week or so to get them to come back and take a look. So best to have the coffee girl or the realtor take those pictures before the bank guy comes out because that's kind of like the cutoff there.
Well, yes, and also like a lot of times I work in cash, right? So that there isn't a bank, right? So I'm
Mhm.
I'm copying a bank's strategy, but a lot of times we don't work with banks. Typically, we only work with banks when the property is expensive. Um,
Right.
so
So
if
you're
we're
getting
doing
hard money loans. You're getting like a hard money loan or a third party lender that's lending against the value of the property.
yeah, if you're doing like a construction loan, but like a lot of times what I'll do is I'll bring in promissory note that could be actually secured on the property because you can do those very cheap in the United States. It could be a joint venture, right? Someone else who has the same goals as you to go and do some projects in the United States. Because
So you're
honestly,
raising then Canadian funds and securing them on American properties with promissory notes, etc.
so yes, but typically with them, I will raise American funds from Canadians, just because the currency differences.
Yeah, but they're gonna have to. Yeah, they'll go to
Yeah.
the bank. They'll bring 100,000, and the bank will turn it into 50K or something like that. But what's really beautiful and maybe let's talk about that for a second. People are afraid to convert their money into US, but they're not looking at the fact that when they win down there, they get to reinflate it when it comes back. So, how do you have that conversation for someone who is like trying to raise money for the States, saying, look, yeah, your dollar is going to deflate, it's going to convert, and there's going to be probably a conversion fee. I don't know if they charge you a huge fee at when you convert, say, 200 grand or something, but there's a conversion, there's a cost of business. How do you have that conversation to say, look, your money's not like deflating, it's just converting?
Yeah. Um, so whether I have this conversation or not, I actually have this. The way I look at this is, yeah, you're going to be putting your money down. It's the best thing in the world to get paid back in US.
Mm-hmm.
It's you do a flip, you get your $50,000 US. It feels amazing. Um, But if they are it is a common question because I have there's some private lenders who, especially out of Alberta, that have been like, I really would prefer to do this whole thing in Canadian funds. And I have done it both ways, where I've accepted Canadian funds or I've accepted American funds. The hard part is if you accept Canadian funds and then you go to the US and the US dollar is not as strong when you go to give back the money. What happens is then you have to come up with more money in order to be
Yeah.
able to do that, right? Which is obvious, right? But then you go, well, then why would someone invest with you? Because they're going to end up taking all the risk and taking the risk of the exchange rate
Mhm.
going up or down, right?
Yeah.
And which is not necessarily true. So I did have another person out of Markham who did lend me the exact same amount of money as the person from Alberta. The same situation happened, but I collected American money. We were paying, I believe, 12% on a prom note for that. And it got to the end and they said, well, the US dollar is down 3% from when we were before. So that's technically like a 3% cut on me whenever I sell it. And if you're in the position where, I've borrowed American money, I have lots of options that I can provide to them. Like I could borrow your money, right? We could even do it on a month by month basis, right?
Mhm.
Well, and then when a dollar corrects, we'll give you your money back. We'll get the full amount, and we'll continue to pay you the high interest rate. Whereas if you borrow from money in Canadian dollars, they're going to be like, I want my money now. And you're like, okay, well, obviously, anytime anyone wants some money, you can give them their money. But it's harder to try to renegotiate in because they have the power in that
Yeah.
situation. If you have the power, what I always want to do is I always want to find a solution for the investor because the best investor is the one that does it twice, right? So I don't want this to be a downside for them. I want to find
Mhm.
a
Mhm.
solution that works to make this work, right? So we can be as flexible as we need to be, right?
Yeah, I've borrowed money from American partners to invest in Canada, and so the money comes over, and I'm like, oh, I need 5 grand. I need a 5 grand draw or whatever, and so they send like 3,700 American, and then it inflates. But I always made sure that I was saying, okay, I'm not borrowing Canadian money. I'm borrowing American funds, and whatever that exchange is, when I return that money, it's going to be returned in American, and the interest rate is American because it's weird because it hits and then it inflates and then it deflates but it's really the same kind of asset value. The only thing you're losing is like currency exchange, which kind of sucks. But at the same time, like just leave it in USD and go to the store. And when you hit your American card at McDonald's, they'll do the conversion, and like you can do it that way too. So there's lots of ways to do that. So um, on the property side of things, what advice would you have for people who are just completely, they're like, I don't even know where to start, where to look, um, and the markets can vary so much on price. Like there's places on the East Coast that are 750 for a bungalow, and then there's places where that same house in the Midwest is like 175 grand. So what would be some advice if someone was like, I want to go into the States and I want to find something that works for me? What
Yeah.
advice would you give to them?
I think it's about having a conversation to figure out what it is that when they say it works for me, like what is it that works for you? Are you looking
Like the
for a flip?
strategy,
Yeah.
flips or
Yeah. Are
holds?
you looking to do a burr and hold your money? Are you looking to do a long-term hold, like a turnkey where you're just putting your money in and it sort of sits in the property? It's figuring what works for them and then finding the markets that matches with those same goals, matches with the amount of money they have. Because, a lot of people, especially from Ontario, all excited about Florida, but you're like, Florida works amazing for certain strategies, and even different parts of Florida works for really good for certain strategies. And other strategies, it will work, but you could do a lot better in different markets. So
Yeah.
instead of trying to force a round peg in a square hole, what strategy are you trying to do first? And let's try and figure out what that is. Like, and if you're like, hey, I want to make a lot of appreciation, then pick appreciation market. If you're looking for a cash flow market, pick a cash flow market, right? And then once you determine that, figure out what is the risks of this market, right? Like, and what has happened in the past, because the past typically repeats itself, right? So if you want to
Especially in the
look,
United States,
yeah,
there's a boom and bust. Because it seems like every investor I talk to out there, they talk about like a 5 or 7 year kind of carousel where it's like, okay, where are we in that turn? Because
yeah,
when you look at Canada, it's very linear. We don't really have like a boom and bust. The government keeps shoveling money into the fire, and they're like, okay, let's keep everything inflated forever. So in the States, they're just like, nah, people are just like, no, too expensive, and they stop buying. And then the market starts to go down. The the local like Amazon will pull out. They're just like, it doesn't make sense. We lost our tax thing. Huge
Yeah.
factories now empty, and they're just like, whatever. We're moving two counties over, and now that's the spot. So how do you how do you evaluate um those conditions that you're talking about? What sort of information do you rely on?
Well, a lot of times I just look at the past. Like, so say you are looking at, we just talked about Florida, but like, if you, and it depends on what you think is happening, right? Like my personal opinion right now is we're in like what's called rolling recessions, right? It
Mm-hmm,
comes, it
mm-hmm.
goes, it comes, it goes, and it's seasonal. Like, I couldn't sell anything between Thanksgiving and New Year's, right? American
Yeah.
Thanksgiving and New Year's, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so but now it's selling, right? And so it
Yeah.
goes up, it goes down, it changes. A lot of it's depending on where you're investing. If you're going into like the low income property areas, um, like we couldn't rent stuff out in January or February in those areas
Mm-hmm.
because people didn't have the deposits. So we had people who were passing the screening, but they didn't have the deposits. So you had to wait until March till they got their money back from the IRS from the
Mm-hmm.
tax returns. It's like if you're in those sort of markets, that's how it works, right? There's just certain times it just is going to
There's
be
like
better.
a seasonality to,
Yeah.
and the same with Canada, like, oh, I'm behind on my rent, but CRA is going to give me my tax return. I'll catch up in April. It's like, okay.
Yeah. It's the
So
same thing,
there's a
right?
seasonality, but so what you're saying is define the strategy and then define the market and then understand the market. So where do you get the information to understand what's going on in that market? Who do you rely on for the source?
Well, there's a lot of different apps out there. Like Americans love their apps.
Oh yeah.
So there's lots of apps to do this. And depending on if you're just like looking at the history, you're like, you can just go and be like, hey, what happened to the housing prices in, Cape Coral, Florida, in 2007, right? Let's look at worst case scenarios,
You
right? Let's
jump
look
on
at,
something like Zillow and just go back to the history or even
yeah.
go to the county website and look at the purchase price of that house in '07, and you'll be like, oh, it was worth 25 grand and now it's worth 75 grand or something. So
Yeah,
things
and you can go as
change.
simple as that, or you can go detailed, or like with Zillow, and you can get like I'm having a brain fart right now for
Well, they
some of
got
those apps,
rental history,
XC or
they
whatever,
got,
right?
yeah, all that history is in line. Yeah.
But then you can go as simple as just even going to Google, typing in Fort Myers, Florida, average home price graph for this date, from 1900 to 2024, and it'll draw you. You'll
And
find a
see
graph.
if
You'll
it's
see the
doing
graph.
that or see if it's doing that or see if it's
Yeah.
doing that. Yeah.
And just
Yeah.
to understand where it is, and like if depending on what strategy you're in, like you might not want to be in a market that has big drop-offs, right? If you need to
Yeah.
sell, or if you're planning to stay for a long period of time, you can ride out a lot of stuff, right? Because
Hmm.
people who didn't have to sell in Florida in 2008, they
Yeah.
they
They're
did
doing good
okay.
now. Yeah. They're
Yeah.
doing good
They,
now.
but like those properties, like typically if a full recession happens, if you look at the history, it's gonna be like Florida and Arizona that take it first, right? In California.
Hmm. Well,
They're gonna be
there's a lot of vanity in those markets, right? People go for the hot weather,
yeah,
and then if the economy gets bad, a lot of those houses were second houses, and so they're just like, whatever I can get for it before the ceiling falls on it, I'm out. And then they sell it for whatever, and that can really drive the prices down. And that's one thing that I always caution people with the United States is like you got to know what you're dealing with, because there's no safety nets in the United States in that. Like Canada's always bailing out the housing market. They're always meddling in the housing market to make sure that people don't lose their shirt completely. But in the States, you can lose your shirt completely. You can they
yep.
don't care. There's no one out there. America doesn't care about you.
No, it is a more of a free market that way,
Yeah.
and it works with everything, right? So, compared to depending where you are living in Canada, like for Ontario, you can only raise the rents a certain amount every year.
Yeah.
Whereas in many states, this isn't across the board, but in many states, if the things are going well, you can jump your rents extensively, whatever to whatever market is, right? And if
Hmm.
you're charging too much, people won't pay to rent there, right? Which
Free
they allow
market.
the market to run it itself. And if the things aren't going well, the rent will go down as well, right? It's
Hmm.
whatever the market rate will be, which is a lot different, right? So,
Yeah. I love that capitalism. Just like, hey, raise it as much as you want. You want $5,000 a month? good luck. And then the guy down the street's at like, well, I'm going to be at 2,700. And then all of a sudden the guy around the corner is like, well, I'm going for 23. I want to fill it. And the other guy's like, I'm going to go 19. And it's just like, it's just like, the guy next to you selling eggs. He's like, I'm going to undercut the guy next to you. And that's capitalism,
Yeah,
which really, if you're in the business of making money, I feel like the United States is a place where money is more of a current flow. Like there's a currency flow. Because do you hold property down there? You rent property down there, or are you not in
I
that
do it
game?
all.
Okay. So whenever I look at a buy and hold in Canada, and someone says, "Oh, I have a 5-year term," and I'm like, "This is insane." Like, do you know in the States you can get a term that lasts what, 30 years
Yeah.
at that interest rate?
Yeah, so typically, even as Canadians, typically the mortgages are 30-year term and 30-year amortization. So you can ride these out. In the States, you can inherit other people's mortgages who set these
Hmm.
up when the rates are at a really good point, which is called a subject to,
Yeah.
right? So yeah, you can
But
do
not
that.
in Canada. Not in Canada. I don't I think the longest I've seen is like a 7 or a 10-year note.
Yeah, I've seen some tens, but typically the rates aren't good on them.
Yeah. So like how can you call it a in buy and hold investment if you're subject to market fluctuation and interest rates every 5 to 7 years? Like
Yeah,
like when I started hearing about that, because I didn't know, I don't typically deal with mortgages. I'm on the flipping side, hard
yep,
money in
yep,
and out. But then when I'm like, so what you're saying is I can get a 3%, I can buy a 1 or 2% note from an existing seller and take over their mortgage, and it has 25 years left on it.
yeah.
And then I know my taxes, I know my mortgage for 25 more years, and rent goes up. Like now it's making a lot of sense, which I think is why a lot of Canadians are kind of not abandoning the buy and hold, but certainly Ontario, you're seeing like a migration.
But even their variable rates are done a completely different way. So what they call them, and everyone knows understands, I think, what a Canadian variable rate is. But in the
Mm,
US, they call them ARMs, right? Adjustable
okay.
rate mortgages. And if you get, say, like a 5-1 ARM, that means that every 5 years, your mortgage will then start adjusting on the annual, like the renewal date. So
Hmm.
you'll get 5 year, like you can continue to do this mortgage, right?
Hmm.
Um, it's not like it has to
So it's like
reset.
fixed for 5 and then it readjusts, and it fixed for 5 and it readjusts.
No, no.
So
So it's a fixed for 5, and then it adjusts every year if it's a 5-1, right? So you'll
oh,
start
so then
adjusting.
after that, now you're into a Canadian mortgage, just
Yeah.
a regular old
But the thing is,
Canadian
like a
mortgage.
Canadian one, like, because I have a variable mortgage on this house I'm sitting in right now. And what happens is, the rates, the Bank of Canada changes their rates and it just goes up instantly.
Next
Whereas
month.
there's only
Yeah.
on the renewal date, like the 1 year
See,
date. But it's not a real
another
renewal.
another check for buy and hold in the United States, and that's when I started researching that more and more on the whole buy and hold and cash flow side of things. I was like, a Canadian house doesn't seem like much of a great passive, if you can call it passive investment, but it doesn't seem like a great investment to be holding long term comparative to the terms and opportunity in the United States. What's your opinion of that?
I think it depends on where it is, and where it's located and what you've bought, right? I still know people who can do great things in Canada. I'm not going to be the one who's going to completely poo-poo
Yeah,
on
you
this,
come
but
to Winnipeg and you buy a house for 120 grand. Like, okay, but still that's 6 or 7%. And in
yeah.
3 to 5 years, they're gonna ask for another, or not even. You can fix it for 5, and in 5, you'll maybe get another 5-year fix. But
But
still
it's going
doesn't
to come
seem
down
like a
to
great
like the
investment.
laws too, right? Of the province or the state, right?
Oh yeah, RTV, and like you might as well go to Alberta now, and things
Yep.
are more expensive. So
Yeah. So I think like if you're going to be a Canadian investor, like at least if I was a Canadian investor, I'd be going out east or going to Alberta, right? Like where
mhm,
I want
rent control
I want
or
to
lack
get
of.
rid of rent control. Yeah, I want more of a free market. I want to be able to have, be able to do evictions in a timely manner. I want to raise rent if it makes sense and if the market can allow it, right?
Yeah,
I want to be able to buy stuff at a reasonable purchase price. I like getting paid in US dollars. I like that to get some of those, like, you can still buy $100,000 houses in Canada. The difference is they're typically in smaller markets.
yeah.
Whereas you could be going and buying $100,000 house in Houston or in
Mhm. San
Jacksonville,
Antonio,
in a big city with a lot of,
Tennessee. We could give them the short list, but
yeah.
there's lots and lots of markets, and there's even markets where you can go and get these things for less. Like
Yeah.
you just you gotta watch out and do your research. So, we could go all day, but I think the best thing to do would be for people to, one, check out your podcast, which is
Canadian Investing in the US. And while you're talking about that, Bryce was in episode 265. Dave was in episode 264 and 132. So if you want to hear
yeah, I'm
these
gonna be
guys
I'm
be
starting to
interviewed by
cut
me.
reels. I'm cutting reels out of ours.
Yeah.
So you'll see them coming up on my Instagram. But more importantly, I'm a huge proponent of getting education from people who are there doing it active. And so how do they connect with you on that level? What should they do? How do they find you?
So my coaching program is Canadian Investor. You can go to CanadianInvestingInTheUS.com, or you can go to glensutherland.com/coaching. But in all honesty, even go to the website. And what I would honestly do before signing up is reach out to me. Let's do a call and let's make sure that it makes sense.
Yeah.
Right? Let's make sure that it's what I teach is what I'm doing, because what I teach is the strategies I do. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I do personally do subject to seller financing, lease options, sandwich leases, wholesaling. But I don't, if you're like, I want to do wholesaling, don't take my course, right? I'll teach you
You're about
basics.
actually getting in on properties, doing
Yes.
deals. And that's a big difference, because there's lots, like, you want to learn a remote wholesale,
Yeah,
there's
there's
probably
better
10,
programs than
there's
mine.
10 guys out there with other programs that can do that. But as a Canadian, and you're looking to actually take some capital, some prom notes, bring them over, do some deals, hold some property, actually get your hands dirty.
Let's just make sure it's the right thing, right?
Yeah.
Do a call. Because go
So
ahead.
glensutherland.com/coaching.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Glen, I really appreciate you stopping by and demystifying this whole thing, because there's a migration happening, and it's not. I don't feel like it's getting better in Canada. So we should all just, if you're serious, you want scale. I tell this to everyone. Like, I think the scale is the biggest factor for moving to the States. 40 million Canadians, 440 million Americans. Like, it just there's 10 times more things. If you think you're the biggest fish in like New Brunswick, cool. Go be the smallest fish in Miami and make twice as much money as you're making today. Like, it doesn't add up, for me anyway. So,
And the lenders want to lend to you. They're in the business of lending funds.
oh yeah,
There's
there's
no
no
limit to
shortage.
lending.
Yeah, they're everywhere.
Yeah.
So yeah, reach out to Glen, go to his website, check out the coaching, and I really appreciate you stopping by, Glen.
Oh, like always, Bryce, great catching up.
All right, until next time, guys, we'll catch you on the next episode.
Hey there, I really hope you enjoyed that episode. And as always, if you want to listen to more daily interview content, make sure you subscribe. And if you're an active real estate investor and you're doing deals and you'd like to get featured on this show, then just head over to daveinterviewyou.com. Now at moneypartnerformula.com, we help real estate investors to create a process for predictably getting capital so they can do more deals without relying on hard money lenders or the banks. We do this by building them a private capital marketing system. Now, if you want help turning yourself into a big money capital attraction machine, then book a call with our team to see how we can help. Just visit moneypartnerformula.com to find out more. All right, take care, and we'll see you on the next interview.